Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with performance psychologist Dr. Alex Auerbach to discuss sport psychology. Alex earned his PhD in counseling psychology with a specialization in sport and performance psychology from the University of North Texas. He has worked with some of the best athletes in the world in the NBA, NFL, MLB, and Olympians, as well as high performers in other domains like elite military units, Fortune 5 companies, and venture-backed startups. He is the CEO and co-founder of Momentum Labs, a mindset coaching service making the best practices from pro sports accessible to performers everywhere, and currently serves as a performance psychologist for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Alex's new book is titled Called to Greatness, Your Personal Playbook for the Pursuit of Excellence, which was the focus of our conversation. One key takeaway from my conversation with Alex was the profound influence mindset has on athletic performance. The way we interpret adversity, setbacks, physiological arousal, interactions with teammates, and the unpredictable flow of a game can dramatically shape how we perform. I was especially struck by the idea of embracing failure as an essential part of growth. When developing mastery in any skill, failure isn't just inevitable, it's necessary. Those moments of frustration and struggle are what drive the changes in the brain that allow us to improve. Ironically, by trying to avoid discomfort, we may actually be limiting our potential for long-term performance. Another powerful insight was the importance of becoming familiar, even comfortable, with the heightened arousal of stressful situations. Exposure to challenge over time trains the mind and body to remain steady under pressure, allowing athletes to think clearly and rely on their hard-earned instincts. This, Alex explained, is the foundation of elite performance and the hallmark of effective preparation, an idea we explored in depth throughout our conversation. If you're an athlete, a leader, or simply want to become better at a particular skill you're passionate about, this episode will give you the blueprint necessary to optimize your preparation and build the mindset of a champion. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Dr. Alex Auerbach. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Ryan, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Very excited. Your new book is called Called to Greatness, Your Personal Playbook for the Pursuit of Excellence. And it details a lot of principles in an area of psychology known as sports psychology. And just for the listener's sake, sports psychology tends to be broken up into these two pieces where you have a clinical side and a performance side. And the clinical side would be, literally treating patients, giving therapy, addressing different mental illness and things like that. And then the performance side is just sort of getting the most out of the athletes, whether it's physical or mental health. And so Alex focuses on the performance side. So we're going to spend some time diving into some of the principles he lays out in his book that relate to performing at your peak potential. So let's start by talking about the capacity of athletes to do work. It's the first thing that you tackle in your book, and it's this idea that professional and amateur athletes, or pretty much anyone that's trying to accomplish a goal, they have a capacity that can be depleted or enriched, right? And this could be related to mental health, it could be physical health, but it's the ability to perform at your peak potential. So, in your opinion, what are some of the most important practices that athletes need to work on in order to maximize their capacity to do work and to feel their best when they're performing?
This is probably one of the most important things I write about in the book, so I'm glad we're starting here. Because the basic idea is that if you want to do anything meaningful or significant or challenging, you're going to have to build your way to that, right? Nobody just comes out and rolls out of bed and runs a marathon, right? Or gets promoted on day one to being CEO or whatever it might be. You've got to build a really solid foundation, set of skills, set of practices, internal, belief in yourself, all these things to get to the point where you can deliver at the highest level. And the way that you do that is by taking on progressively higher and harder challenges, giving yourself an opportunity to rest and recover, consolidate the learning and grow and develop, and then do it again. The easiest way to understand this is kind of like the work you do when you go to a gym, right? You go to the gym and you bench press or you squat one day, and then you rest a little bit. And in theory, the next time you go do it, you're a little bit stronger. It may not show up that day on the weight rack, right? But like if you do that enough times, you're going to be able to take on more and more weight. And the same thing is true with us from a psychological perspective, right? The more you see yourself experience stress, you process how you deal with it, you navigate that discomfort, you see yourself succeeding, then you rest and recover, you consolidate that learning, you're better prepared to go take on something at the next level. And so this is obviously facilitated by a number of different practices, but the core principle is basically pushing yourself to do more and more, which is what you need to do if you're trying to win, say, an NFL championship.
Now, staying on this topic of like physical capacity, I recently got into resistance training and I watch a lot of videos and do reading of articles for things like this. And, with my fresh eyes, I look at it and I see that there's kind of this old school mentality of muscle building and physical fitness where it's hard work, and there's a little mention of recovery. And then I look at today's information and there's tons of focus on recovery, which is this idea that you can work at your maximum, but then you also have to be mindful of that recovery process. Um, do you have any thoughts as to, is the old wisdom absolutely wrong? Is recovery, one of the most important things that athletes need to focus on?
The short answer is it depends, right? So for the average person like me, it's very if you're speaking strictly from a physical perspective for a minute, right? Like you might not need as much recovery as you think. It's pretty rare for people to actually overtrain physically the way, say, an NFL player might overtrain, right? But if you're training for 4 hours a day or 5 hours a day, you absolutely need some recovery if you're going to have any sort of ability to come back and do it the next time. So I think it's complicated, but at its core, for most performers, the reality is that if you strain yourself in any way, physically, mentally, recovery is going to facilitate a stronger return to baseline the next day, right? And you can think of it again if we use physical strength as the metaphor here. Like if you go to the gym every day and you bench press every day, eventually you're going to tear a pec, right? Even if you're just an average person like me or you, that's the long-term implication of that kind of work with no recovery. So even for the most average athletes like me, you've got to have a little bit in there. But for certainly high-level competitors, whether that's in business or in sport, recovery is so important for being able to rebound and come back effectively. And we've got lots of data that supports this at this point. We know that leaders who engage in post-work recovery have higher performing, more creative, more innovative teams, for example, because their teams feel empowered to also rest and recover. And when people are recharged, they think more creatively, they engage differently, they have more motivation and more energy. We know that from a sports perspective, having enough time to rest does reduce the risk of injury, for example, or reduce the risk of burnout. So it is very important. And then from a learning perspective, we know recovery is absolutely foundational to consolidating learning, which is a huge part of really any kind of high performance. You're going to have to build some skill. You're going to have to learn new mental models. You're going to have to come up with ways to work in this high intensity, space. And if you're not doing good learning, then you're going to be stuck.
So speaking of good learning, I want to talk about practice and preparation. And in your book, you lay out some principles that that pass the sniff test, right? Good practice. You have to repeat motions over and over and over again so that you can push those activities into, the automatic parts of your brain. You talk about varying the situation. You talk about making sure that when you're practicing, that the situation that you're practicing in somewhat represents the actual environment that you're going to be applying it, right? In your experience, what do you think is the most common thing missing from practice that is surprising to you?
I think people tend to skip over variation the most. So when I think about, I was a pretty competitive soccer player growing up. When I think of my training, a lot of what I did was like go out there and do the same thing basically every day. It's like very high repetition, right? You're going to pass the same pass, you're going to cross the same cross, you're going to corner kick the same corner kick, and then we're just going to scrimmage, right? So you go from repetition to representativeness, basically, as deep of a practice as we can get. We're going to try to
Mm.
make it as game-like as possible. But if you look at the research in soccer and skill development in soccer, so much of what you see at the highest level is a function of variation, which is sort of taking the constraints of a game and manipulating them a little bit so that you have to play under different conditions. So if you think about practicing soccer in South America or in Spain, they play a lot of what's called small-sided games, right? It's basically instead of 11 on 11, it's 5 on 5 with smaller goals and different rules. And that kind of constraining of the training forces people to come up with novel solutions that they could actually employ in a game when the circumstances look similar. Because even if you're playing, say, 11 on 11 soccer, like there are going to be times where there's a bunch of people up in your face, right? Well,
Mhm.
it's hard to replicate that, a bunch in, say, a scrimmage, but you can replicate a ton of that work if you just play 5 on 5 for 30 minutes, right? And so the value in variation, I think, gets missed. And I see it a lot even in pro sports. When I was working in the NBA, I would watch players try to, improve their three-pointer. And the way that they would do that is just take the same shot, thousands of times at the end of every practice. And that can be valuable up until a point, but it's very rare that you're going to get a wide open three-pointer from the corner in live time with nobody saying anything, no music, no fans, nothing, right? Like, so if we're going to try to get this skill to show up in a game, then we might need to do it with someone with a hand in their face or rushing down at you or with some crowd noise and play with some of the different things that allow you to transfer that skill most effectively to the competition. So that's the one I think that people just don't appreciate the value in.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of thought that has to go into that to accurately predict kind of what your body needs in order to learn effectively. You mentioned pumping and crowd noise. That was something that I always noticed that was lacking from, even myself practicing in high school volleyball or something like that, where there's this, it almost felt like it didn't matter how many times I practiced my set or my hit because I had all this extra arousal coming from a crowd, a ref blowing whistles, even just the knowledge that you're actually playing a game against a competitor. It really interferes with any sort of rote practice.
That's exactly right. I mean, and the data again backs this up. So when we look at really high level performers and we think about choking, for example, right? Choking is basically like an extreme underperformance, a missed opportunity in a moment of pressure, right? So you're thinking about the penalty kick to win the World Cup or free throw to win a game, right? They don't all have to be extremely, extreme scenarios. What happens is they have some degree of interference with the automatic processing that goes on in the brain, right? So when you think about executing, say, a free throw, like if you practice that thousands of times, it should be pretty automatic. But when the crowd is loud and the game is on the line, that process of executing the motor circuitry in your brain is disrupted a little bit and it becomes easier to choke or mess up. And that's what they think causes some choking. Or you choke because you're distracted. Those are sort of the two theories, and they can kind of work hand in hand, right? Either your motor coordination is disrupted, and that's where you get like in golf, you get the yips, right? Or you're just distracted, which is like Michael Phelps is standing in his speedo behind the backboard with all the gold medals on his neck, waving his arms like crazy, and all you can think about is Michael Phelps, and you can't think about the free throw that you have to take, right?
Right.
And those it is very hard to replicate that stuff in practice. So the best thing that you can do is create a wide variety of conditions that could show up, right, as best you can to simulate them. And you do that with variation and representativeness so that when you get there, your brain can sort of say, like, well, I haven't seen this exact scenario, but I've seen something like it. And in
Mhm.
this scenario that was similar, this is how I executed and this is what worked. And there's all sorts of neuroscience stuff we could get into
Mhm.
around this, which
Well,
which
yeah,
we you can if you want to, but
it's interesting
that's the
because
basic principle.
it's interesting because you almost forget that in your head having to switch contexts from context A to B to C and make quick decisions, like that's also a skill that needs constant repetition. Like you can't just, if you're a football player, you can't just, oh, you can't over train the physical movements and then under train the part where you have to quote unquote read an offense and make audibles, call audibles, make changes. That's a skill too that can, I would imagine, just gets better and better through repetition. And kind of what you're saying is that even though you can't reproduce every situation, simply the skill of training in these varied conditions builds that muscle memory that you need, and it reduces the arousal that the athletes might experience when they're confronted with these new situations, which makes sense. Um, so I want to talk on a related note about the idea of playfulness, because sometimes I come across an article or a take on practice in sports that emphasizes how you have to infuse some fun and playfulness into practice. After all, even other professional athletes are still playing a game, and in the context of, let's say, mixed martial arts, every now and then you'll hear a commentator say, look at it, he almost looks like he's having fun out there, even though he's intently focused. Like sometimes there's a casualness and a fluidity to how fighters move in the ring. My question for you, though, is, do you think that this infusing of playfulness is is just a cherry on top of the dessert, or is it something more substantial, something that needs to be in place?
You're leading the witness. I love it. Yes, it absolutely needs to be in place. So it's not, I mean, think about any job, right? Like whether you play basketball, you play football, or you show up and this is part of what you do and you do podcast interviews, right? Like at some point, it just becomes work and you get paid for it and it becomes the thing that you do to support your family, right? In sport, we have a really unique opportunity, which is that the thing that these guys are doing is also a game, right? But it loses that playful flavor as you come in and every single day you're talked to about what you've got to do better and what we're going to do in practice today and how
Watching tape,
focused you need to
yeah.
be. Yeah, like it's just it's not that that's bad, but you just lose some of why you started in the first place. And for most of these players, it was a start because this was fun, right? And maybe it was an escape from some situation or it brought them closer to their dad. There's lots of possible reasons, but at its core, they enjoyed it and it was fun, right? And then they stuck with it long enough and then they realized, oh, I'm pretty good at this. And then you realize, oh, I might have a future in it. And so as you get further and further along, you sort of lose touch with a lot of the reasons that you started in the first place. And this happens for coaches too, by the way. Like this happens for everybody who is in sport, I think, to a degree, because as you climb the ranks, it becomes more and more serious and more intense, and you have less and less time to just enjoy what brought you here, which for most coaches, for example, is like trying to get the most out of people or building great relationships with young men or young women, right? And that gets lost too when you're constantly being evaluated. And so I think if you can do little things to infuse some fun and some play into the work, it keeps people in touch with why they got started in the first place. And we know play is great for, it's a form of recovery, but we also know play is great for, doing some consolidating of that learning, for creating innovative solutions, for feeling more restored, for feeling more energized. And so it's an easy way to get people to do a little recovery that doesn't have to be like sitting there with, your legs up while someone massages you or closing your eyes and meditating, right? We can have a good time. And so when I was in Toronto, we instituted a little bit of opportunities to let players just kind of mess around and have a good time, because that's how you get some of that like camaraderie built. That's how you get some of the fun back into the sport. And that's what keeps people sustained over time, right? Is making sure that they're in touch with why they started in the first place versus, just sticking with the monotony over and over and over again.
Hmm. Uh, now, in let's go inside a locker room for a moment. There's some, oftentimes, I would imagine there are some complex dynamics going on. You have, especially again, in team sports where you have players that are considered leaders, you have rookies, and everyone's trying to gel together and towards a common goal. Um, and I'm thinking specifically in the area of professional football, which is your current role right now. Um, there's this balance that seems difficult to achieve, which is, on one hand, you kind of want like the leaders in the locker room to instill discipline and to be these kind of stoic figures that are examples to the younger players, and showing, we're not afraid, we're confident, and these pillars in the locker room. And maybe to a certain point that they're like holding the younger players accountable, like you need to work on this, you need to work on this. You can't make these mistakes if we want to win a championship, something like that. On the other hand, this seems like it could easily get out of control with respect to younger players not feeling, let's just say, psychologically safe. Like they might feel like it's an environment that makes them afraid, and they don't feel like they have the freedom to make a mistake. Um, in your view, what would you recommend to teams to strike this balance? Is there a secret sauce to striking this balance?
It's a really interesting and complicated one, actually, because you want some passing of the wisdom down, right, from the veterans who understand what it takes to be at the highest level. You want some of that to sort of be soaked up by the younger guys. But sometimes there's an issue where the older players don't really want to transmit that information because there's competition here, right? And you might take
Yeah.
my job. So that's an interesting dynamic to route, deal with. And then I think the psychological safety one is also really interesting in that I think sport in itself is not all that conducive to creating psychologically safe environments. Like the reality is, you might get fired if you make a mistake. You might get cut. You might not have a place here if you do that enough. And so it's hard to create a circumstance where people really do feel safe to freely admit mistakes and deal with that. I think that the way that you go about that has to do with the way you talk about dealing with failure. So I think not necessarily making sure everyone feels comfortable all the time, but making sure that people understand that failure is a part of the learning process and clarifying when it's okay to fail and when we need some like high level performance, there will be consequences for failure. I think is a pretty reasonable thing to do in very high level sport where there are legitimate consequences and real issues that come as a result of people underperforming or not being ready. And then from the veteran to rookie perspective, I think what you're trying to get them to do is first build an authentic relationship. Like forget sharing what you know or any of that wisdom, right? But let's just get everybody connected. And if we can get people connected, then the conversations will sort of flow naturally, right? A rookie might ask someone for advice, or an older guy might see something and share something as a function of that, but it happens in the context of them really knowing each other versus, trying to just sort of manufacture this exchange of information in a really transactional way. And I think what the best teams do, and I don't know if you've watched that show Quarterback on Netflix at all, but you can see some of it in there. The veteran players are being open, they're talking about, their feelings and how things are going, right? And there's a great clip of Kirk Cousins sharing with his coach in season two, like, I just don't feel like I'm playing that well. And I'm like, man, that's a veteran move right there, right? To be willing to share that. And so as a veteran, if you can model that for younger players and show them how to do that and the way to communicate that, I think you can start to get a really healthy locker room environment where everyone feels supported, people can be honest, and it's all built on the authenticity of the connection.
That's very interesting, and it's a nice little segue into the next thing I want to talk about, which is, I would say, the bulk of your book is it could be summarized as mindset related insights. So I wrote a little note like the thoughts of champions, right? That a great deal of the challenge with getting athletes and others to perform at their peak potential is how they think. And so you dedicate multiple chapters to different domains. Let's talk about confidence. Another term in psychology known as self-efficacy. They are not the same thing. You feel free to talk about the differences. But you know, what is the most common barrier to building this confidence in ability that high performing athletes need?
That's a wonderful question. I think the way I think of confidence is, and I know you know this because you've already mentioned self-efficacy, right? So we know self-efficacy comes from, which is just to back up one step, self-efficacy is basically like confidence in your ability to execute a specific skill or task, right? So it's not this global sense of, I always feel good about myself. It's, I feel I can do this thing, like shoot a free throw or throw a pass or kick a ball, right? And it tends to come from four sources, right? Good self-talk, or what they call verbal persuasion, physiological appraisal, right? So, learning to see your activation effectively, vicarious learning, right? So seeing, someone like you doing something that you want to do, right? So like, oh, I just watched my teammate, kick that pass, and I feel like I can kick that pass too. And now I'm going to forget the fourth one because my brain isn't working as well as I'd like it to. But, I think when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about, so when I think about confidence, those are the things I'm thinking about. I think preparation might be the fourth one. Um, and so a lot of what it comes down to really is being ready. A lot of confidence is a function of feeling like you've done the work to justify what you're about to do. And so when I'm thinking about helping performers build confidence, I'm really thinking about two things. I'm thinking about past success. What are the things that you've done well in the past that are like what you're about to go do now? Which works great in sports, right? If you've even if you've never played in a Super Bowl before, for example, like you've probably played in a big game at some point in your career. Is it the exact same as the Super Bowl? Of course not. But can you identify things that you did in that last big game that would work here? Probably. And so if we can think about what you've done well in the past, we can draw on that as a source of strength, as a source of information for how we best get ready for the big performances we have coming up in the future. And then the second piece, of course, is putting in the work to actually prepare. I think a lot of what undermines performance is, performance anxiety. And that's a function of feeling not ready, basically, right? Or what could go wrong. And if you haven't prepared for every possible scenario, within reason, of course, then you're going to feel a little bit anxious and that's going to be disruptive. And most people interpret anxiety as not feeling confident. And so there's lots you can play with there too, as far as reframing or thinking about your, how you think about your arousal. But I do think if you can just put in really high quality practice, what you're going to find is that you do feel ready for a lot of the big performances that come up. And of course, the other factors matter, but I think feeling really prepared can help you feel like you're in control, ready to go. That feeling of control gives you that sense of, okay, I'm confident, I got this. Let's get after it.
Hmm. Now, when you look at players as a whole, and that we acknowledge that different players are going to have different personalities. Um, I would imagine that some of them would reject this, you know, model of optimized preparation. And I guess what I mean is, as I was preparing for this interview, I was thinking back at famous athletes that are known for lack of preparation. Like you'll see Dennis, the Dennis Rodman model, where even though he did practice the skill set, he would, was notorious for partying before games and stuff like that. And I don't have a ton of examples like that. I know Lawrence Taylor had some issues, off the field and partying and stuff like that. But I'm wondering, do you think that like some players have this desire to embrace this lack of preparation and sort of lean on their natural abilities?
Absolutely. I mean, especially at the highest level, you'll find a lot of players who have always been the best player on their team, right? And so when that's been the case, you get used to and conditioned really into knowing that, oh, my talent will just kind of carry me. That gets really hard when you're surrounded by, a bunch of other people that are in the exact same situation. So it does take work often to figure out how to prepare effectively, because until you've gotten to say, really high level college football or pro football, you probably haven't had to prepare as hard as everybody else has had to prepare to deliver. Then what you do with that free time is a different discussion, right? If you're Dennis Rodman and you're flying to Vegas before a game or whatever, that's a very unique scenario. But oftentimes I do think players need to learn how to prepare. They need to learn how they can best get themselves ready. And becomes a bit of a separator, right? You have some guys who will really throw themselves into that process and figure it out. Again, you think about the show Quarterback on Netflix. Kirk Cousins has his notebooks from 12 years ago, and he goes back and reviews them. But he wasn't always that way, I'm sure. He had to learn that from, he says, he had to learn that from one of his coordinators. And so you've got to sort of figure out at the highest level how to get yourself ready. If you're lucky, there are people like me around who can help you do that. If not, then you've got to find ways to do that yourself, or you just won't invest in it. And the end result is, Dennis Rodman was obviously a pretty good player, but I don't think we're talking about Dennis Rodman as an NBA champion without Michael Jordan, who I think pretty clearly figured out how to get ready.
Right, right. Um, Now, you mentioned earlier something about managing arousal. So you talk about in the book that it is essential for top performing athletes in these tense moments of high competition to dial in their arousal and manage that physiological feeling. What are some things that you say to athletes to help them reduce arousal when it's too much for them in game time situations?
There's really two paths I take them on. One is first figuring out if we can do something to actually lower that arousal, right? So a common one that people talk about all the time right now is something like breath work, right? Where we might
Right.
do some slow, controlled breathing, where we know, longer exhale than inhale is going to help you slow your heart rate down. And if we do that consistently enough, we can get you to a place where you're a little bit less activated and a little bit closer to your sweet spot. We don't want you having no arousal, right? We need some of that to go out there and play. But if you're like most performers across industries, you're probably running a little bit hot and we need to just cool you down a little bit. So I might use some simple strategies like that or grounding, other things from our training as psychologists, right? That can help someone be a bit more present, can slow down and control their arousal that way. The other thing I work a lot on is the framing of that arousal, right? So there's some really interesting research that talks about the way that we name our arousal essentially contributes a lot to the impact that it has. And this gets to some of the mindset stuff I write about in the book. But when I'm working with athletes, I'm really teaching them three or four kind of key framings of their arousal to help them perform better. The first is that when you're feeling the butterflies or you're feeling aroused, right? This is excitement versus anxiety or nervousness. Calling it excitement tends to get you a little bit more focused, a little bit more energized, a little bit more positive, if you will, and can facilitate better performance. The second is that this is a sign that you care. So oftentimes people feel when they feel nervous, they sort of blow things out of proportion. And if you can sort of harness the fact that this is just important to you and that you want to do well, but that it's not the end of the world, right? I remember, my own experiences as say like a college student, right, where I had a final my freshman year that I was late to, and I remember thinking like, oh my God, I'm going to fail out of college. This is going to be the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And that at the time, of course, is not very helpful for actually writing the essays I needed to write. So if I could have gotten to a place where I was like, okay, I'm feeling this way because I really care about doing a good job, and now I'm going to try to do the best I can, that would have been a bit more effective. And of course, I didn't fail out of college, but that's a conversation for another time. The third that I go for is determination, right? So if you think of activation or arousal as your brain and body getting you ready to do something effortful. Like this is your brain and body doing you a favor, right? They're giving you the energy you need to perform and persist. And so, training yourself to see this energy as, oh, this is the sign I'm determined to do my best work. This is the sign that I'm determined. I'm going to use this energy to push myself can be quite helpful. And then fourth is that this is an opportunity, right? Whether it's a chance to show what you're made of or a signature strength, that helps tap into the challenge mindset a little bit, if you will, and get people oriented toward what's possible versus what might go wrong. And so I'm working with athletes on each of those four framings and then trying to find one that really resonates for them that they can practice over and over. And if you want to see a great example of what this looks like, if you go to Google and you type in Aaron Donald's self-talk video on YouTube or Google, you'll find a 43-second clip of Aaron Donald, who may be the best defender in NFL history, depending on who you debate with, engaging in all four of these appraisals before a Super Bowl. And you hear him talk out loud to himself about the opportunity he has. And he says stuff to his teammates too that helps them activate these same mindsets. But he talks about being determined. He talks about being ready. He talks about caring about the game. And he's leveraging all four appraisals to help himself stay focused, be prepared, be fully locked in as he gets ready for what was the biggest game of his career.
Yeah, I really I really like the viewing stress as something that enhances your performance, this literature. Um, I don't know if you've ever heard, have you ever heard Lisa Feldman Barrett's story about her daughter's martial arts tournament?
I have. I know Lisa quite well, and really appreciate that story from her. Yes.
Yeah, for the listeners, Lisa Feldman Barrett wrote a book about human emotions, and in it, or perhaps another one of her books, she talks about this idea of viewing stress as something that can be beneficial, and she references her daughter's martial arts tournament. Her teenage daughter was in a tournament. She was experiencing some nerves, looking around, seeing that some of the boys were bigger than her, and she overheard a pep talk with her daughter and her coach at the time, and noted that her coach did not say, don't worry about it, just relax. The coach said, get your butterflies flying in formation. And it's one of the more profound encapsulations of using stress as something that can be enhancing, right? It's not resisting, it's, as you put it, reframing. And so, could you talk a little bit more about, maybe some examples? Have you seen the change in working with all the athletes that you have? Is this something that takes time? Is it a concept that is easily embraced by the athletes that you work with?
I think the concept itself resonates, but actually getting to use it is quite hard, right? Like anything, it's a lot of what we do is skill building and skill development. And so, just the same way that you don't learn to throw a football 60 yards the first time you go out there, or run through five tackles the first time you go out there, right? You're not going to get the reframing right the first time you go out there. And so you're going to have to practice and experiment and find what works for you. And unfortunately, people lose patience far too quickly because they expect themselves to just get it right away. It feels like for some reason we should be able to do that because it's our brain instead of our body. But again, maybe a longer conversation than you bargained for here, Ryan. But I think if you put in enough practice, what you'll find is you'll end up with self-talk just like what you see from Aaron Donald in that video. One of the things I love pointing out when I show that video to athletes I work with is he's very obviously practiced this for a really long time. There's no way that he shows up at the Super Bowl with this most amazing self-talk, pregame without some level of working on this and experimenting and getting himself to a point where that's what he genuinely thinks and believes and says to himself before a game. And so the concept itself, I think athletes latch onto because, who wouldn't want to experience their common pregame anxiety or pregame nerves as something more effective than that. But doing the work to actually get to a point where you can train your mind to embrace the butterflies, as you put it, is quite challenging. And so typically what we do is we just start with a small experiment. I laid out four ways that you could frame your experience, like pick one and let's try it. Let's see how that works for you. And you're gonna have to come back to it and you're gonna have to repeat it over and over again. And you're gonna have to try it for a few weeks. And we're gonna have to see, what impact that has on your overall experience. And if it works, great. Like let's double down and let's build on that. If it doesn't work or it doesn't resonate, that's okay. We can change it and experiment with something new. And once we find something that works, then we can really build like pre-performance routine, for example, that leverages that reframing that gets you into that headspace quicker. Or we can, speed up the time it takes to go from anxious to in your zone of optimal functioning by using that reframe more effectively. But that is all a function of practicing this essentially like you'd practice any other skill.
So this self-talk, this internal monologue, seems to be essential as it relates to another pair of terms that you talk about in the book, grit and resilience. This how we talk to ourselves when we encounter difficulties. And this Aaron Donald video has lots of interesting ideas about reframing arousal, and there it's a great example for a pep talk. But let's focus in specifically on failure and adversity. So when players are at their lowest, right? Maybe a generic pep talk is not enough, right? How do you coach up players in situations where they're dealing with adversity and failure?
For me, I'm really looking for what's the opportunity to grow or get better as a function of this experience we're having. But it's tricky to time that up, right? So if we take, say, the players who just lost a game, I might not do anything right after they lost a game. It's really hard for people to get out of the emotional experience that they're having. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just let people recover and sort of take a breather and then come back to it with a fresh set of eyes. But if it's happening, say, in practice and they're really frustrated, I might ask them to take a step back and then, okay, let's think about what are the benefits of what we're practicing and failing at now, right? What's the opportunity to get better here? How are you getting better as a function of continuing to try? And, with all great athletes, I have a brilliant colleague who always talks about becoming a failure factory. And I really like her
Mm.
metaphor there, where it's sort of this idea that your goal as a high level performer is to figure out what you can extract from these failures as quickly as possible and iterate and get better. And so we can train you to do that through becoming an objective observer or a scientist about your own performance. We can help you get a bit more out of that failure. And so when I'm in those moments, that's what I'm trying to get them to do, to step out of the emotion a little bit, right? To see it from like a neutral third party perspective to the extent that they can, and then try to implement and apply something that they've learned. I train all the athletes I work with to answer three questions at the end of every training or every practice. The first is, what did you do today that you want to keep doing? So you'll notice it's not what did you do well or what was good. It's intentionally non-judgmental language. The second is, what did you do today that you want to do differently? And again, this is not, what did I mess up or what was so bad? It was, what do I want to do differently? Because we're trying to get to that scientist sort of neutral third party perspective. And then third is, what did I learn and how do I apply those things in the next day's practice?
You mentioned earlier this idea of the yips, which I would imagine as a sports psychologist, it's something that you may get asked a lot about, which is in short terms, it's kind of a breakdown of muscle memory. But could you just talk about the yips and talk about what you might do for athletes that are experiencing these types of behaviors?
Yeah, you framed it really well, Ryan. I think it's this sort of like breakdown in your ability to execute something that you otherwise would be able to execute in your sleep, essentially. And it often comes on the back of a big embarrassing mistake or something going terribly, horribly wrong, for you. And then it's like, oh my goodness, I really don't want to make that mistake again. So I often think of the yips really as a form of anxiety, right? It's like I'm nervous about executing this same skill that I've executed countless times because I had this one mistake, and I feel, there's lots of emotion wrapped up in it, right? Guilt, shame, disappointment, frustration. But at its core, a lot of the yips is maintained by, I'm worried I'm going to do that again. And so the way I think about moving people through that is through basically exposure, right? Like, okay, well, if this is what you're worried about, like we're going to have to go out there and try it. And we're going to have to do it several times until you get more comfortable with it again. And we're going to have to do it under various conditions. And we're going to have to get you doing it, in front of a crowd eventually, right? Whatever the case may be. And so you can talk about it to a degree, but I think most of the time you just got to actually get out there and kind of work through it physically, with some, graded exposure basically to get you to that point. And so that's what I'm often working on when I'm working with an athlete in that situation, is getting more and more comfortable with executing that movement again. And then you can do some work around, say, something like self-compassion, right? Where we need to let go of the shame, guilt, blame, whatever it might be that we have toward ourselves for that mistake, and can give ourselves permission to move on and get back to what we're great at.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about motivation before we wrap up. It strikes me that it would be so surprising to hear that it's difficult to motivate high performing athletes. Like on the surface, you would think, I mean, these are people that have worked their entire life to get to a certain level, especially at the professional level. And I just find it baffling to think that motivation could be something that's lacking at that point. When you encounter situations where all the skills are there, but there isn't motivation, what is your approach to managing that?
For me, a lot of motivation in that situation comes down to understanding and clarifying what's most important to the athlete, and then how do we get back in touch with the values that can drive motivation. So I know you're familiar with this, Ryan, as a fellow psychologist, but acceptance and commitment therapy and the kind of core idea around values there, that really designed to be a motivator for long-term behavior. That's why we do that work. And so for me, if you're feeling unmotivated, first I'm trying to explore. I don't typically think of someone not having motivation. I typically think of them as having more motivation to do something else, right? So when people say, I'm depressed, I have no motivation, what I often think is, well, you're just motivated to stay in bed. There's not no motivation. We have to figure out how we channel that most effectively. And so values becomes a way to kind of get at some of that, right? What's most important to you? What would the idealized version of yourself look like if you were behaving that way? And my guess is it's probably not exactly what we're seeing right now. And so what are the barriers to doing that? And it may be, a function of burnout, or it may be a function of some conflict they're having with a coach or whatever it might be. And then we work through that because we're trying to get them to be the highest, best version of themselves. And I think to do that most effectively, anchoring in, this is what you say is most important to you. This is who you want to become. How do we do that? I think is the most powerful way to get there.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. It's been absolutely enlightening hearing you talk about the principles that you lay out in your book. Again, it's called to Greatness, Your Personal Playbook for the Pursuit of Excellence. Thank you so much, Alex Auerbach.
Thank you, Ryan, for having me.
For more on Alex, visit alexauerbach.com. That's AlexAuerbach.com. Or pick up a copy of Called to Greatness, Your Personal Playbook for the Pursuit of Excellence, wherever books are sold. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with two of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowethatpodcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or on X at WDWDTpod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?